The room smells of stale cigarettes, industrial disinfectant, and something else. Something metallic and wrong. In a nondescript safe house, somewhere outside Montreal, in the cold February of 1953, a woman lies motionless on a narrow bed, leather restraints binding her wrists and ankles. Her name has been redacted from the surviving documents. Perhaps she was a psychiatric patient. Perhaps she volunteered, lured by promises of revolutionary treatment for depression. It doesn't matter now. What matters is the tape recorder humming in the corner, feeding an endless loop of phrases into the headphones clamped over her ears. The same words, over and over and over. Her breathing is shallow, chemically induced. The sodium pentothal drip continues its patient work, keeping her suspended in that twilight state between consciousness and oblivion, where the mind's defenses crumble like wet paper. This isn't fiction. This isn't the fever dream of conspiracy theorists hunched over shortwave radios in darkened basements. This happened. The documents exist. 20,000 pages of CIA records confirm it. The fraction that survived when Richard Helms ordered the destruction of MK-Ultra files in 1973. What you're about to hear is drawn from declassified government documents, congressional testimony, and the scattered memories of those who survived. The government believed they could reprogram human consciousness. They believed that with the right combination of drugs, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, electroshock, hypnosis, and sound, they could erase a person and write someone new in their place. And for 2 decades, they tried. The question that should haunt us isn't whether they attempted this. We know they did. The question is, what did they learn? And are those techniques still being used today, in rooms we'll never see, on people whose names will never surface? Not. In the summer of 1957, a woman we'll call Mary Carter walked through the doors of the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal, seeking help for what her doctor described as moderate anxiety and postpartum depression. She was 32 years old, a schoolteacher, a mother of 3. Her youngest child was just 18 months old. When she left the institute 6 months later, she could no longer read, could not prepare a simple meal, and when her children ran to embrace her, she looked at them with the blank confusion of someone meeting strangers for the first time. She would spend the rest of her life trying to remember who she had been, trying to reconstruct a self that had been systematically dismantled by a doctor who believed he was saving her. The man responsible for Mary's condition was Dr. Ewen Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist who by the mid-1950s had risen to become one of the most respected figures in North American psychiatry. He had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association. He was a man whose credentials were impeccable, whose confidence was absolute, and whose theories about the human mind would lead him to commit acts that, decades later, would seem almost incomprehensible in their calculated cruelty. Cameron's domain was the Allan Memorial Institute, a psychiatric facility perched on Mount Royal in Montreal, housed in a mansion that had once belonged to a wealthy businessman. The building itself was elegant, almost genteel, with its stone facade and manicured grounds. Patients arrived expecting treatment, expecting care, expecting the kind of help that one might receive at any modern psychiatric facility of the era. What they found instead was something that resembled a laboratory more than a hospital, a place where human beings became subjects in an experiment that their doctor believed would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. At the center of Cameron's work was a technique he called psychic driving. And to understand the horror of what happened at the Allan Memorial Institute, you must first understand the cold, methodical logic that gave birth to this procedure. Cameron believed that mental illness was the result of faulty patterns of thought, neural pathways that had been carved too deep, memories and behaviors that had become pathological. His solution was radical in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He would erase those patterns entirely, reduce the patient to a blank slate, and then rebuild their personality from scratch with new, healthier patterns of thought. He called this process depatterning, and he pursued it with the zeal of a man who believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change psychiatry forever. The technical apparatus Cameron developed to achieve this goal was as ingenious as it was sinister. Patients selected for psychic driving would first be subjected to what Cameron called the depatterning phase. They would be given massive doses of drugs, combinations of barbiturates, amphetamines, and other sedatives that would keep them unconscious or semi-conscious for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Some patients were kept in drug-induced sleep for periods as long as 65 consecutive days, waking only briefly to be fed or use the bathroom before being sedated again. During these extended periods of unconsciousness, their minds drifted in a twilight state between sleep and waking, between existence and oblivion. But sleep alone was not enough for Cameron's purposes. While the patients lay unconscious, he subjected them to electroconvulsive therapy, but not the carefully calibrated treatments used elsewhere. Cameron administered what he called Page-Russell shocks, electroconvulsive treatments given at much higher intensities than standard practice, sometimes delivered multiple times per day. The seizures these shocks induced were violent enough that patients sometimes suffered compression fractures in their spines. The stated purpose was to disrupt existing neural patterns, to shake loose the connections that formed personality and memory, to reduce the complex architecture of a human mind to rubble. Once Cameron believed he had successfully deconstructed his patient's existing personality, the second phase would begin. This was psychic driving proper, and it was here that the true strangeness of his methods became apparent. Patients would be fitted with what looked like modified football helmets, leather caps with speakers mounted at the ears. In some cases, the speakers were placed directly under their pillows or mounted in the walls of specially constructed isolation chambers. These chambers were small, dark rooms where sensory input could be carefully controlled, where patients lay alone with nothing but the voice in their ears. The messages that played through these speakers were recordings Cameron had made of his patients during therapy sessions, or sometimes statements he had written himself, designed to address what he saw as the root of their psychological problems. These recordings would be copied onto loops of tape, and the loops would play continuously, the same phrases repeated over and over, sometimes for 16 hours a day, sometimes for 23. A patient being treated for anxiety might hear her own voice, recorded in a previous session, saying, "I am a good mother. I am calm and capable. I do not worry unnecessarily." These phrases, or variations on them, would repeat hundreds of times per day, thousands of times per week, drilling into the patient's consciousness during their most vulnerable state. Cameron theorized that this repetition, combined with the blank slate created by depatterning, would allow new thought patterns to take root, would literally reprogram the patient's mind with healthier ways of thinking. He believed he was engaged in a kind of psychological reconstruction, building new minds inside the shells of the old. The clinical language he used in his papers reflects this mechanical view of human consciousness. He wrote about patients as though they were machines requiring debugging, systems that could be wiped and rebooted with better software. The reality, as experienced by his patients, was something altogether different. Those who retained enough memory to describe the experience later spoke of a special kind of torture, a slow dissolution of self that was more profound than physical pain. Imagine lying in darkness, unable to move, barely conscious, while the same phrases repeat in your ears, hour after hour, day after day. The messages burrow into your semi-conscious mind, displacing thought, displacing memory, until you can no longer remember what thoughts are yours and what thoughts have been placed there. Some patients described feeling as though they were disappearing, as though the person they had been was being slowly talked over, drowned out by the relentless repetition of the recorded voice. The isolation chambers where some of these treatments occurred added another layer of disorientation. Patients would be placed in these small, dark rooms, sometimes with their arms restrained, sometimes with tubes for feeding, so they would not need to leave the chamber for days at a time. The only sound was the loop of tape, playing its message. The only reality was the voice and the darkness. Time became meaningless in these spaces. Patients lost the ability to distinguish between minutes and hours, between days and weeks. Their entire universe contracted to the size of that small room and the repeating message in their ears. Mary Carter, the woman we met at the beginning of this account, was subjected to psychic driving for nearly 5 months. Her recordings told her that she was not anxious, that she was a confident and capable person, that her fears were unfounded. Cameron administered 68 electroconvulsive treatments during her stay, far more than would have been considered even remotely appropriate in standard psychiatric practice. When she finally left the Allan Memorial Institute, she had lost virtually all memories of her life before treatment. She did not recognize her husband when he came to collect her. She could not remember her children's names. She had to be taught how to use a toilet, how to eat with utensils, how to dress herself. The woman who had been a teacher, who had read literature and discussed philosophy, could not read past a grade 3 level. The confident woman described in her psychic driving tapes did not exist. Instead, Cameron had created a person who was barely functional, who would require care for the rest of her life. Another patient, a woman named Madeline, entered the Allan Memorial Institute in 1958, complaining of fatigue and mild depression following the death of her mother. She was a legal secretary, 41 years old, known for her sharp mind and attention to detail. Cameron determined that her attachment to her deceased mother was pathological and subjected her to depatterning and psychic driving designed to eliminate this attachment. The recordings played to her contained statements minimizing her mother's importance, restructuring her emotional landscape according to Cameron's theories. After 86 days of treatment, including extended sleep therapy and continuous psychic driving, Madeline emerged with almost no memory of her mother at all. But she had also lost the ability to perform her job, could no longer manage her own finances, and experienced severe anxiety in social situations, far worse than anything she had experienced before treatment. The irony was lost on Cameron. He noted in his files that the treatment had been partially successful in eliminating the problematic attachment, but that further sessions would be needed to address the new symptoms that had emerged. What makes Cameron's work particularly chilling is not just the damage he inflicted, but the absolute certainty with which he operated. He was not a monster cackling in a laboratory. He was a respected professional publishing papers in prestigious journals, presenting his findings at international conferences. Other psychiatrists came to observe his methods. The procedures he developed were funded in part by grants from the Canadian government, and, it would later be revealed, by the CIA's MK Ultra program, which was searching for methods of mind control and interrogation. Cameron believed until the end of his life that he was on the verge of a major breakthrough, that his methods would eventually be refined and would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. The patients knew differently. Those who recovered enough cognitive function to understand what had been done to them spoke of a violation more profound than physical assault. Cameron had not just harmed their bodies, or even their minds in the conventional sense. He had attempted to erase who they were, to reach into the most intimate space that exists, the interior landscape of thought and memory and self, and to rewrite it according to his own specifications. The fact that he failed to create the healthy new personalities he envisioned was almost beside the point. The damage he did in the attempt was irreversible. By the time Cameron died in 1967, while mountain climbing in the Adirondacks, he had subjected hundreds of patients to some variation of psychic driving and depatterning. Many never recovered. They lived out their lives in a kind of twilight, unable to work, unable to maintain relationships, unable to reconstruct the selves that had been taken from them. Their families watched them struggle with the simplest tasks, watched them fail to remember birthdays or anniversaries or the names of their own children, and wondered how this could have been allowed to happen in a modern, civilized country, in a respected medical institution. The answer to that question is perhaps more disturbing than the procedures themselves. Cameron was allowed to continue his work because he operated within a system that granted doctors enormous authority over patients deemed mentally ill, because his credentials were impeccable, because the era believed strongly in the power of scientific progress to solve human problems, even problems as complex and delicate as the human mind. He was allowed to continue because few people looked closely at what he was actually doing in those isolation chambers, because patient testimony was easily dismissed as the unreliable reports of mentally ill individuals, because the promise of a cure for mental illness was too alluring to question too closely. The legacy of Ewen Cameron and the Allan Memorial Institute stands as a reminder of what can happen when scientific ambition proceeds without ethical constraints, when the desire to cure becomes detached from the imperative to do no harm, when human beings are viewed primarily as problems to be solved rather than as people deserving of dignity and care. The recordings have long since stopped playing. The isolation chambers have been dismantled. But somewhere in Montreal, there are still people living with the consequences of those experiments, their memories still incomplete, their selves still fragmented, still trying to answer the question of who they were before someone decided to make them into someone else. In the spring of 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency began a program that would transform American citizens into unwitting laboratory subjects in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. The program had a cryptic name, MK-Ultra, and its architects believed they were engaged in a race against Soviet mind control techniques. What they created instead was a sprawling network of cruelty that would shatter lives, destroy families, and raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. The drug at the center of these experiments was lysergic acid diethylamide, known as LSDI. Chemist Albert Hofmann had first synthesized it in 1938 while working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland, but its mind-altering properties weren't discovered until 1943, when Hofmann accidentally absorbed some through his skin. The experience he described, a kaleidoscope of colors and a dissolution of the boundaries between self and world, caught the attention of intelligence agencies looking for tools to break enemy agents and create the perfect truth serum. What made LSD particularly attractive to the CIA was its potency. A dose measured in micrograms, barely visible to the naked eye, could completely reshape someone's perception of reality for 8 to 12 hours. Sidney Gottlieb, a biochemist with a clubfoot and a stutter, became the chief architect of MK-Ultra. His colleagues described him as brilliant and utterly ruthless, a man who kept a poison garden at his home in Virginia and believed that the ends of national security justified any means. Under Gottlieb's direction, the CIA established a network of testing sites across the United States. Universities received covert funding to study the effects of hallucinogens on students. Prisons became laboratories where inmates were given LSD in exchange for reduced sentences. Mental hospitals provided a steady supply of vulnerable subjects whose complaints would be dismissed as symptoms of their illnesses. But perhaps the most disturbing operation within MK-Ultra was the one codenamed Midnight Climax. In San Francisco, beginning in 1955, the CIA established a series of apartments that appeared to be ordinary homes, but were actually sophisticated surveillance centers. The agency rented spaces in areas like Telegraph Hill and North Beach, decorating them with an eye towards seduction. Red velvet curtains hung in the windows. Soft lighting created an atmosphere of intimacy. Paintings that the agents considered artistic hung on the walls. Behind these paintings and within the walls themselves, cameras and microphones captured everything that happened inside. The CIA hired prostitutes to work in these safe houses. The women would bring clients back to the apartments, men who thought they were simply paying for sex and perhaps a drink. The prostitutes had been given a simple instruction: slip LSD into the drinks of these unwitting customers. The dosages varied wildly, sometimes 50 micrograms, sometimes 500, with no medical supervision and no consideration for the psychological state or physical health of the subjects. The men would begin to feel the effects within 30 to 90 minutes. Reality would start to bend and twist. Colors would become impossibly vivid. The familiar world would transform into something alien and terrifying. George White, a former narcotics agent known for his heavy drinking and violent tendencies, ran the San Francisco operation. He would sit behind a two-way mirror with a pitcher of martinis, watching as the men in the next room lost their grip on reality. White kept detailed notes on what he observed. Some men became paranoid, convinced that the woman they were with was transforming into a monster. Others curled into fetal positions, weeping uncontrollably. Still others became aggressive or catatonic. White viewed it all with the detachment of a scientist observing lab rats, never considering that these were human beings experiencing psychological torture for which they had not consented and could not understand. The men dosed in Operation Midnight Climax had no framework for what was happening to them. This was the 1950s, before LSD had entered popular culture, before anyone outside of a small circle of researchers and intelligence operatives knew such a drug existed. These men didn't know that their perceptions were being chemically altered. They had no way to reassure themselves that the experience would end, that they weren't losing their minds permanently. Many believed they were going insane. Some thought they were dying. They would stumble out of the apartments hours later, their sense of self fractured, unable to articulate what had happened because they themselves didn't understand it. How many of these men suffered lasting psychological damage? How many relationships did they destroy in the aftermath, unable to explain their behavior or the terror that now haunted them? The CIA never bothered to follow up, never tracked the long-term consequences of their experiments. But not all of MKUltra's victims were strangers picked up by prostitutes. Some were the agency's own employees, dosed by their colleagues in what was considered research into how agents might react if an enemy slipped them a mind-altering substance. This brings us to the case of Frank Olson, a biochemist whose death remains one of the most controversial mysteries in the history of American intelligence. Frank Olson worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the Army's Center for Biological Warfare Research. He was 43 years old in 1953, married with 3 children, and by all accounts a dedicated scientist and devoted family man. His work involved developing aerosol delivery systems for biological agents, a job that had begun to weigh on his conscience. Colleagues later reported that Olson had expressed moral qualms about the direction of his research, particularly after witnessing biological weapons demonstrations in Europe that summer. On November 19, 1953, Olson attended a retreat at Deep Creek Lodge in rural Maryland with about a dozen other scientists and CIA officials. The retreat was meant to be a working meeting to discuss classified projects. On the second night, during after-dinner drinks, Sidney Gottlieb personally laced a bottle of Cointreau with LSD. Approximately 20 minutes after everyone had consumed the drugged liqueur, Gottlieb made an announcement. He told the assembled men that they had just been given LSD as part of an experiment. Imagine that moment. Imagine feeling the first strange sensations as the drug begins to take effect, the slight unmooring from reality, and then learning that you've been deliberately drugged by your own colleagues. For Frank Olson, the experience was devastating. While some of the other men later described finding the experience interesting or even enjoyable, Olson became deeply disturbed. Witnesses reported that he grew anxious and paranoid, unable to sleep, convinced that he had made terrible mistakes in his work, and that his career was over. In the days that followed, Olson's mental state deteriorated. His colleagues, recognizing that something had gone seriously wrong, decided he needed psychiatric help. But rather than taking him to a hospital or a civilian psychiatrist, they brought him to New York City to see Harold Abramson, an allergist who was secretly working with the CIA on LSD experiments, and had no formal training in psychiatry. Olson was accompanied on this trip by Robert Lashbrook, a CIA agent assigned to watch him. On the night of November 28, 9 days after being dosed with LSD, Frank Olson crashed through the closed window of his 10th floor room at the Statler Hotel in Manhattan and fell to his death on the sidewalk below. Lashbrook was in the room at the time, asleep in the other bed according to his account. He called the hotel operator with a statement that has echoed through the decades as one of the most chilling in this entire dark story. He said that Olson had either fallen or jumped from the window. The official verdict was suicide. The family was told that Frank had been depressed and had taken his own life. They were not told about the LSD dosing until 1975, more than 2 decades later, when the Church Committee investigations into CIA abuses began to uncover the truth about MKUltra. When the Olson family finally learned what had happened, they were given a personal apology from President Gerald Ford and a settlement of $50,000. But they were not given answers to the questions that haunted them. Was Frank Olson's death truly a suicide? The final act of a man shattered by an LSD experience and consumed by guilt over his weapons research? Or was it a psychotic break, a moment of complete disconnection from reality caused by the drug? Or was it something far more sinister, a murder disguised as suicide to silence a man who knew too much and was becoming unreliable? The evidence supporting the murder theory is deeply troubling. In 1994, the Olson family had Frank's body exhumed for a proper autopsy. The forensic pathologist, Dr. James Stars, concluded that the injuries to Olson's skull were inconsistent with a fall from a window. Instead, he found evidence suggesting a blow to the head before the fall. There were no cuts on Olson's body from breaking through the closed window shade and heavy glass. The trajectory of the fall suggested he may have been thrown rather than jumped. And there was the question of why a man in deep psychological distress would crash through a closed window rather than opening it first. Witnesses who knew Olson in those final days reported that he had talked about wanting to leave his job, about moral concerns regarding the biological weapons program. In the paranoid world of Cold War intelligence, a scientist with classified knowledge who was expressing doubts and becoming unstable represented an unacceptable security risk. Some researchers who have studied the case believe that the LSD dosing itself may have been a setup, a way to destabilize Olson, so that his subsequent elimination could be explained away as mental breakdown. We will likely never know with certainty what happened in that hotel room. Robert Lashbrook maintained until his death that he was asleep and woke to find Olson gone and the window shattered. But his immediate phone call after the incident was not to an ambulance or to the police. It was to Sidney Gottlieb. What did they discuss in those first moments after Frank Olson's body hit the pavement? The Olson case became public knowledge only because of the broader unraveling of MKUltra. In 1973, as Watergate consumed the Nixon administration and congressional investigations into intelligence agency abuses loomed, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. But his order was imperfectly carried out. Financial records survived, documenting payments and projects that the CIA had hoped would remain secret forever. When these documents surfaced, the American public learned for the first time that their own government had been conducting mind control experiments on unwitting citizens for more than 2 decades. The documented experiments represent a catalog of cruelty that challenges the imagination. Prisoners at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky were given LSD for 77 consecutive days to study the effects of sustained dosing. Mental patients were subjected to sensory deprivation while under the influence of hallucinogens. Cancer patients at a hospital in New York were dosed without their knowledge or consent. The homeless, the marginalized, the institutionalized, anyone who lacked the power or credibility to complain effectively became potential subjects. What makes these experiments particularly horrifying is not just the lack of consent, but the complete absence of medical oversight or ethical consideration. Modern drug trials involve careful screening of subjects, precise dosing protocols, medical supervision, and extensive informed consent. MKUltra had none of this. Subjects were given wildly varying doses with no consideration for their physical or mental health, no preparation for what they would experience, and no support during or after their ordeals. When things went wrong, when subjects became suicidal or psychotic or violent, the CIA simply walked away, leaving human wreckage in its wake. Operation Midnight Climax continued until 1965, a full decade of dosing unwitting men in San Francisco and other cities. The program only ended when the Inspector General of the CIA finally reviewed it and concluded that it was unethical and scientifically worthless. The random dosing of Johns, picked up by prostitutes, produced no useful intelligence data, no breakthrough in mind control techniques, nothing that justified the moral bankruptcy of the operation. It was cruelty for its own sake, dressed up in the language of national security. The legacy of MKUltra extends far beyond the immediate victims. When the program became public knowledge, it shattered trust in government institutions and medical authorities. It provided confirmation for conspiracy theorists and fed a cynicism about official explanations that persists to this day. How can citizens trust a government that was willing to drug them without their knowledge? How can subjects trust researchers when some of the most respected institutions in America participated in these experiments? The men who ran MKUltra faced no criminal charges. Sidney Gottlieb retired to his farm in Virginia and spent his later years raising goats and tending his garden. George White died of cirrhosis, his liver finally succumbing to the decades of heavy drinking. The prostitutes who dosed the clients were never identified or held accountable. The system protected its own, and the victims were left without justice or closure. Frank Olson's family continues to search for answers. They have sued the government repeatedly, seeking documents and testimony that might finally reveal what happened in that hotel room. Some files remain classified even now, more than 70 years after his death. What secrets could they possibly contain that still require protection after all this time? The story of MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for cruelty within institutions that claim to protect us. These were not rogue agents operating outside the system. They were government officials following approved programs with substantial budgets and high-level authorization. The experiments continued for years because people in power decided that the potential benefits outweighed the moral costs, and because the victims were people without power or voice. It reveals what can happen when scientific curiosity operates without ethical constraints, when national security becomes an excuse for any action, and when human beings are reduced to experimental subjects in someone else's research protocol. The two-way mirrors of those San Francisco safe houses reflected back a disturbing image of America, one that we have still not fully reckoned with or understood. In the basement of a nondescript building in the suburbs of Washington, technicians prepared a chamber that looked more like a coffin than a research facility. The year was 1953, and the Central Intelligence Agency had embarked on a program that would push human consciousness to its absolute breaking point. They called it sensory deprivation research, but what they were really studying was how to unmake a person from the inside out. The chamber itself was an exercise in absolute negation. Every surface had been lined with thick acoustic foam that swallowed sound before it could form an echo. The walls were triple layered, creating dead air spaces that ensured not even the rumble of distant traffic or the hum of fluorescent lights could penetrate. Inside, a shallow tank held water heated precisely to 93 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature of human skin. The theory was simple and terrifying in its elegance. If you removed every possible external stimulus, if you stripped away everything that told a person where they ended and the world began, consciousness itself would start to unravel. The first volunteers were graduate students, young men eager for the $50 they'd been promised for a few days of easy work. They imagined it would be like floating in a sensory deprivation tank at a spa, peaceful and meditative. They could not have been more wrong. Donald Hebb, the Canadian psychologist who pioneered these experiments, had subjects fitted with translucent goggles that allowed light but prevented any pattern recognition. Their hands were encased in thick cotton gloves and cardboard cuffs that extended past their fingertips, making it impossible to touch anything or even feel the contours of their own hands. A U-shaped foam pillow supported their heads. The constant drone of air conditioning masked any remaining sounds. Then the door would close, sealing them in darkness and silence. The changes began almost immediately, though the subjects wouldn't recognize them as such at first. Within the first hour, most reported a pleasant sense of relaxation, a floating sensation that felt almost dreamlike. But by the second and third hour, that comfort began to curdle into something else. The mind, desperate for input, started creating its own. One subject, a psychology student named Frank, described seeing dots of light that seemed to dance in the darkness. At first, they were just pinpricks, random firing of his visual cortex in the absence of actual light. But then they began to organize themselves, forming patterns, then shapes, then fully realized images. He saw a parade of squirrels marching across his field of vision wearing little jackets. He saw rows of eyeglasses moving down a street. He insisted his eyes were open, though in the total darkness, there was no functional difference between open and closed. By the sixth hour, the hallucinations had become more complex and disturbing. Subjects reported seeing geometric patterns that twisted into impossible configuration. They heard voices, sometimes whispering just at the edge of comprehension, sometimes shouting. One man swore he could hear a choir singing. The voice is so clear and beautiful that he wept. When the researchers played a recording of white noise to mask any potential sounds, subjects reported hearing full conversations embedded in the static, messages they were certain were meant specifically for them. The loss of time became total. Without any external cues, the brain's ability to mark the passage of hours simply failed. Subjects would be convinced they'd been in the chamber for days when it had been 12 hours, or believe they'd only been inside for an hour when an entire day had passed. This temporal disintegration created a special kind of psychological terror. They were trapped not just in space, but in a timeless void where suffering could stretch indefinitely. By the second day, the real breakdown began. The carefully maintained boundary between self and environment, that fundamental understanding of where your body ends and the world begins, started to dissolve. Subjects reported feeling as though their arms had detached and were floating somewhere nearby. Others felt their bodies stretching, growing impossibly long, or shrinking to the size of toys. One man became convinced he was split into two separate people, both occupying the same space. The research files contain testimony that reads like accounts from the edge of madness. A physicist, someone trained in rational thought and empirical observation, reported that his mind had divided into multiple separate consciousnesses that argued with each other. He could hear himself thinking from different positions in space, as if his thoughts had locations outside his skull. Another subject described losing the ability to distinguish between his memories and his current experience. He would remember getting up to use the bathroom, and genuinely couldn't tell if he had actually done so, or only imagined it. The suggestibility that developed was the finding that most interested the CIA. Why? Subjects became desperately hungry for any human contact, any confirmation that they still existed as discrete beings in a real world. When researchers would enter to check on them, these previously skeptical, educated volunteers would grasp at any information offered. In one experiment, researchers played recorded lectures presenting fringe, pseudoscientific theories. Under normal circumstances, the subjects, all college students, would have dismissed such claims immediately. But after 48 hours in sensory deprivation, they emerged not only believing the bizarre theories, but actively defending them, their critical thinking capabilities temporarily shattered. One subject, a doctoral candidate in philosophy, reported an experience that haunted him for years afterward. He said that somewhere around the third day, he felt his sense of self simply stop. It wasn't that he forgot who he was or couldn't access his memories. It was that the fundamental feeling of being someone, of having an identity separate from the universe, ceased to exist. He described it as dissolving, like a drop of ink in water, spreading out until there was no concentrated center anymore, just a dilution that went on forever. When the researchers finally opened the chamber and pulled him out, he sobbed uncontrollably, not from relief, but from the overwhelming sensation of being condensed back into a single point of awareness after having been scattered across infinity. The physical effects were equally disturbing. Subjects emerged from the chambers pale and shaking, their movements uncoordinated as if they'd forgotten how limbs worked. Some couldn't stand without assistance, their sense of balance destroyed. Others had difficulty speaking, their words slurred and confused as if they'd partially forgotten language. Most disturbing were the subjects who, upon seeing their own reflections, recoiled in fear or confusion, temporarily unable to recognize their own faces. The CIA expanded the research, building more sophisticated chambers. Some used complete darkness and silence. Others employed random, unpatterned sounds or monotonous, repetitive noises. One particularly cruel variation involved suspension in dense salt water at body temperature in pitch darkness, creating the sensation of floating in absolute nothingness. The military got involved, constructing chambers at bases across the country. The goal was always the same: determine how to break a person down to their most malleable state. The applications for interrogation were obvious and immediate. A prisoner subjected to even brief periods of sensory deprivation became compliant, suggestible, desperate to please. Their resistance crumbled. Their will fragmented. Combined with sleep deprivation, irregular feeding, and isolation, sensory deprivation became a cornerstone of enhanced interrogation techniques. The research from those early experiments in the 1950s informed protocols that would be used in black sites and detention facilities decades later. What made this research particularly insidious was that it left no visible marks. A person could be systematically unmade and then allowed to reconstitute themselves, often with no one the wiser. The trauma was invisible, written in the rewired pathways of a brain that had been forced to question its own existence. Many subjects reported lasting effects, episodes of depersonalization that would strike without warning months or years later, sudden moments where reality felt thin and negotiable, where their sense of self flickered like a failing light bulb. The research continued for years, refining techniques and documenting the progressive stages of psychological breakdown. Scientists mapped the timeline of dissolution with clinical precision, hour by hour, day by day, cataloging each step as consciousness slowly came apart. They were creating a manual for unmaking the human mind, and they were remarkably successful. Even today, the descendants of these techniques persist. Solitary confinement in modern prisons often involves sensory deprivation conditions. Interrogation facilities use white noise, constant light or darkness, and temporal disorientation as standard procedures. The language has changed, made more palatable, but the fundamental understanding remains. Remove a person's ability to orient themselves in space and time. Strip away the sensory input that confirms their existence, and you can reshape them into almost anything. The self, it turns out, is far more fragile than we want to believe. It requires constant confirmation from the external world. Take that confirmation away, and we simply begin to dissolve, drifting apart like smoke in a vacuum. In the basement corridors of the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal, during the cold months of 1957, something profoundly wrong was happening beneath the veneer of psychiatric care. Dr. Ewen Cameron, a man who had once evaluated Rudolf Hess at the Nuremberg trials, who had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, was conducting experiments that would transform human beings into shells of their former selves. His patients entered his care with depression, with anxiety, with the everyday struggles that brought so many to seek help. They left, when they finally left, unable to remember their children's names, unable to feed themselves, unable to perform the most basic functions of human existence. Cameron called his technique de-patterning. The term itself carries a clinical coldness that masks the horror of what it actually meant. He believed, with an absolute conviction that bordered on fanaticism, that mental illness resided in the patterns of thought that made up a personality. His solution was not to treat these patterns, not to adjust them or heal them, but to erase them entirely. To reduce a human mind to what he described as a blank slate, wiping away memories, habits, knowledge, and identity itself. Then, once he had created this emptiness where a person once existed, he would re-pattern them, building what he considered a healthier personality from scratch. The method he chose for this erasure was electroshock therapy, but not as it was practiced anywhere else in the medical world. Standard electroconvulsive therapy, even in that era, used carefully calibrated voltages, administered at specific intervals with strict protocols designed to minimize harm. Cameron dismissed these precautions as obstacles to his vision. He used voltages that were 30 to 40 times the strength of normal treatments. Where conventional practice might involve one treatment every few days, Cameron administered shock after shock after shock, sometimes delivering electroconvulsive therapy multiple times each day for weeks on end. Some of his patients received treatments twice daily, others 3 times. The sessions stretched on for 30 days, 40 days, sometimes longer. The human brain was never meant to endure such an assault. Each surge of electricity caused a seizure, and with each seizure, memories dissolved like photographs left too long in the sun. Recent memories went first, the immediate past fading into confusion. But Cameron did not stop when his patients forgot the last few weeks or months. He continued, pushing deeper into the landscape of their minds, burning away years of their lives. Valerie Orlikow, the wife of a Canadian member of parliament, came to Dr. Cameron suffering from postpartum depression in 1956. She was a mother, an educated woman, someone dealing with a recognized and treatable condition. She trusted the prestigious Allan Memorial Institute. She trusted the renowned Dr. Cameron. That trust would cost her more than she could have imagined. Cameron subjected her to his depatterning protocol, administering intensive electroshock treatments day after day. Val, as she was known, began to forget. She forgot recent events first, then months disappeared, then years. The electricity burned through her memories like acid through paper. When the treatments finally ended, Val Orlikow could not remember the past 25 years of her life. A quarter century of experience, of love, of motherhood, of growth and learning and living, simply gone. She looked at her husband and saw a stranger. She looked at her children and felt no recognition, no connection to these people who claimed to be her family. The woman who had been Val Orlikow, with all her accumulated wisdom and experience and relationships, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had to relearn everything, who had been robbed of the entire adult life she had built. But the horror of Cameron's depatterning went even deeper than memory loss. His patients did not simply forget their pasts. They forgot how to be human adults. Mary Morrow, another of Cameron's victims, lost the ability to read. She forgot what purpose a toilet served. Think about that for a moment. A grown woman, reduced to such a primitive state that she could not remember this most basic aspect of human life. She had to be retaught, like a toddler, the fundamental functions that make up daily existence. The electricity had not just erased her memories, it had burned away the learned behaviors and knowledge that separated an adult human from an infant. Jean Steele entered Cameron's care as a competent adult and left unable to recognize her own husband or children. She could not cook a meal or clean her home. The skills she had spent a lifetime acquiring were simply gone, deleted by the repeated electrical storms Cameron had unleashed in her brain. Her family became caretakers to someone who wore a familiar face, but who had been hollowed out, replaced by someone who had to learn again how to navigate the world. Cameron was not satisfied with destruction alone. Depatterning was only the first phase of his grand experiment. Once he had reduced his patients to what he considered blank slates, he moved to the second phase, repatterning. He would attempt to build new personalities, to reconstruct these human beings according to his own specifications. The method he chose was as disturbing as the erasure itself. He placed his depatterned patients in drug-induced sleep for days or weeks at a time, keeping them in a state of unconsciousness with cocktails of barbiturates and other sedatives. While they slept, helpless and unaware, he subjected them to what he called psychic driving. Helmets were placed on their heads, fitted with speakers. Through these speakers, Cameron played recorded messages on endless loops. The same phrases, the same instructions, the same messages repeated thousands upon thousands of times. A patient might hear the same recording telling them who they should be, how they should think, what they should believe, playing continuously 16 hours a day for weeks. Cameron believed he could write new personalities into these emptied minds through sheer repetition, hammering simple messages into the void he had created. The personalities he tried to create were deliberately childlike, reduced, simpler than what had existed before. He was not trying to restore his patients to who they had been. He was trying to create something new, something he considered more manageable, more compliant. The recordings told patients they were confident, they were happy, they were cured. Meanwhile, the human beings receiving these messages lay unconscious, unable to consent, unable to resist, their minds being shaped like clay by a man who saw himself as a sculptor of consciousness. The funding for this nightmare came from an unlikely source. The Central Intelligence Agency, through an operation called Nuit Cultra, was desperately searching for methods of mind control in the 1950s. The Cold War had created a paranoid climate where intelligence agencies convinced themselves that enemy nations were developing techniques to control human consciousness, to create programmed agents, to extract information from unwilling subjects. The CIA wanted their own methods, their own weapons in this invisible war of the mind. They could not conduct such experiments openly, not in the United States, not under their own name. So they created front organizations, societies with academic-sounding names that existed only to funnel money to researchers willing to push the boundaries of ethics and legality. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology was one such front. It provided Cameron with $169,000, a substantial sum in that era, money that came directly from CIA coffers, though it appeared to come from a legitimate research foundation. Cameron had no idea his funding came from the intelligence community, or so he would later claim. But the CIA knew exactly what they were funding. They received reports on his work. They knew about the depatterning, about the electroshock treatments that far exceeded any medical standard, about the sleep rooms and the psychic driving. They knew, and they continued to fund it because Cameron's brutality might yield the results they desperately wanted. If he could erase a personality, could he erase specific memories? Could he implant new loyalties, new identities? Could he create the tools the CIA imagined they needed? The work continued for years. Patient after patient entered the Allan Memorial Institute seeking help for depression, for anxiety, for postpartum difficulties, for the normal struggles of human existence. They were told they would receive treatment. Instead, they became experimental subjects in a program that stripped them of their very selves. The beautiful setting of the institute, housed in a mansion overlooking Montreal, concealed the suffering within its walls. The prestigious reputation of Dr. Cameron His credentials and his authority provided cover for what was nothing less than the destruction of human minds. Some patients received not just electroshock and psychic driving, but additional torments. Cameron experimented with sensory deprivation, keeping patients in isolation, cutting them off from sound and light and human contact. He used experimental drugs, including massive doses of LSD and other hallucinogens, sometimes combined with the electroshock treatments. The human beings in his care became laboratories, their minds the proving grounds for his theories. The tragedy is that some of Cameron's patients might have been helped by conventional, ethical treatment. Depression can be treated. Anxiety can be managed. Postpartum difficulties can be addressed with support and care. But Cameron was not interested in helping. He was interested in proving his theories, in achieving the breakthrough he believed would revolutionize psychiatry. The suffering of his patients, the destruction of their lives, seemed not to concern him. He was a scientist, or so he believed, pursuing knowledge regardless of cost. The full scope of what Cameron had done only became clear years later, decades later in some cases. As the survivors struggled to rebuild lives from fragments, as families coped with loved ones who had been transformed into dependent strangers, the story slowly emerged. Legal battles revealed the CIA connection. Documents released under Freedom of Information requests showed the funding, the reports, the knowing complicity of the intelligence agency. The survivors and their families sought justice, sought compensation, sought at least an acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Val Orlyko became one of the leaders in this fight. The woman who had lost 25 years of her life spent her remaining years trying to hold accountable those who had funded and enabled her suffering. In 1988, the CIA finally settled with 9 of Cameron's victims, paying them each $750,000. It was an admission of sorts, though the agency never fully acknowledged the scope of their involvement. The Canadian government later provided compensation as well, recognizing that these experiments had been conducted on their soil, in their institutions. But money cannot restore a lost lifetime. It cannot give back the memories that were burned away, the skills that were erased, the decades that vanished in the electrical storms Cameron unleashed. The survivors lived out their lives with holes in their consciousness, with the knowledge that years of experience and growth had simply been deleted from their existence. Some never fully recovered the ability to function independently. The damage Cameron inflicted was permanent, irreversible, absolute. Dr. Ewen Cameron died in 1967, hiking in the mountains, his reputation intact in many circles, never held legally accountable for what he had done. He never expressed remorse. He appeared to believe, until the end, that his work had value, that the suffering he inflicted was justified by the knowledge he sought. The blank slates he created, the shattered minds he left behind, were acceptable casualties in his pursuit of psychiatric innovation. His legacy is not medical advancement. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when authority goes unchecked, when scientific ambition operates without ethical restraint, when human beings are reduced to experimental subjects in service of abstract theories. The basement rooms of the Allan Memorial Institute, where the depatterning occurred, stand as a monument to this horror, a reminder that the worst cruelty can occur under the guise of healing, perpetrated by those society trusts most to protect the vulnerable. The human mind was never meant to be broken apart and reassembled like a machine. Yet in the dimly lit laboratories and clinical rooms scattered across America during the Cold War, men in white coats and dark suits attempted exactly that. They believed consciousness itself could be shattered, fragmented, and rebuilt according to a blueprint of their own design. They sought to create something that exists only in nightmares and spy novels, a person who could be activated like a sleeper cell, perform tasks they would never willingly choose, then return to normal life with no memory of what they had done. A perfect spy, an unwitting assassin, a Manchurian candidate. The concept originated from fears as much as ambitions. American intelligence agencies had witnessed what they believed were successful brainwashing programs conducted by Chinese and Soviet interrogators during the Korean War. Prisoners of war returned home speaking in strange cadences, confessing to crimes they never committed, their personalities seemingly rewired. Whether these transformations were genuine or simply the result of torture and coercion remained unclear, but the possibility alone terrified the Central Intelligence Agency. If the enemy possessed such capabilities, America needed to develop them as well. Not just to defend against mental manipulation, but to deploy it. The pathway to creating a programmed human being required 3 elements working in concert, each one amplifying the others into something far more devastating than the sum of their parts. First came trauma, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The theory suggested that extreme psychological or physical stress could fracture normal consciousness, creating fissures in the unified self. These fractures might allow entirely separate compartments to form within a single mind, sealed off from one another like watertight chambers in a sinking ship. Second came the chemical component. Drugs, particularly hallucinogens and depressants, could dissolve the boundaries of identity and increase suggestibility to unprecedented levels. Under the influence of substances like LSD, sodium pentothal, or combinations the public would never know existed, a subject's resistance to external commands would crumble. Their sense of self would become malleable, plastic, ready to be molded. Third and final came hypnosis, the programming language for this corrupted human software. In a deeply suggestible state, created by trauma and enhanced by chemicals, hypnotic commands might be installed directly into the subconscious mind. These commands would lie dormant, invisible even to the subject themselves, until triggered by a specific word, phrase, or signal. At least, that was the theory. The experiments began in earnest during the 1950s under the umbrella of projects with innocuous names that concealed horrifying purposes. The most infamous, MK-Ultra, encompassed 149 separate sub-projects involving universities, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and prisons. Within this sprawling network, certain doctors received funding and immunity to explore the darkest possibilities of human consciousness. They needed subjects, people whose lives and minds could be treated as raw material for research. Some volunteers believed they were participating in legitimate psychological studies. Others never consented at all. The layering technique developed gradually, refined through countless failures and human wreckage. Researchers discovered that ordinary hypnosis, the kind performed on stage for entertainment, possessed severe limitation. A person under typical hypnotic influence would not perform actions that violated their core values or self-preservation instincts. The firewall of identity remained intact. To bypass this protection, consciousness itself needed to be fragmented first. Trauma served this purpose with terrible efficiency. Subjects were exposed to experiences designed to overwhelm their psychological defenses. Some endured sensory deprivation in isolation tanks for days or weeks, their minds untethered from reality by the absolute absence of external stimulation. Others faced the opposite extreme, sensory overload through strobing lights, deafening sounds, temperature extremes, and pain. Sexual humiliation featured prominently in many protocols, chosen specifically because it attacked the foundation of personal dignity and selfhood. The goal was to create what researchers called a dissociative state, where the mind protected itself by splitting away from unbearable reality. Once traumatized into fragmentation, subjects received the chemical component. LSD proved particularly valuable for these purposes because it dissolved ego boundaries and made users extraordinarily receptive to external suggestion. In studies that were later partially declassified, subjects were given doses hundreds of times stronger than what recreational users would consume. Under such massive dosing, administered sometimes for days or weeks consecutively, reality itself became negotiable. The difference between memory and imagination blurred. The distinction between self and other grew uncertain. In this liquefied mental state, hypnotic programming could supposedly take root far deeper than ever before possible. The hypnosis employed during these experiments bore little resemblance to therapeutic practice. Using carefully crafted verbal patterns, repetition, and post-hypnotic suggestion, programmers attempted to install alternate identities complete with different names, memories, and motivation. These constructed personalities would theoretically exist beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness, accessible only through specific triggers known to the handlers. The primary personality would have no awareness of this hidden self, no memory of what occurred when the alternate identity took control. Testing whether the programming worked required putting subjects in real-world scenarios. Some experiments involved instructing hypnotized subjects to carry out mock assassinations or thefts, actions their conscious selves would never perform. Researchers wanted to know if the programmed identity would complete the task, then allow the primary personality to resume control with no recollection of what had occurred. The results remained classified for decades, but fragments that eventually emerged painted a picture of partial successes, riddled with failures, and human beings irreparably damaged in the process. The case of Candy Jones stands as perhaps the most disturbing example of what these programs may have achieved, or at least attempted. Born Jessica Wilcox, she became a famous model during the 1940s and 50s, her face gracing magazine covers and billboards across America. Beautiful, successful, and seemingly living a charmed life, she appeared to be the last person who would become entangled in covert mind control operation. Yet, according to her own later testimony under hypnotic regression, her life contained a hidden chapter of horror that her conscious mind had completely suppressed. Jones claimed that beginning in the late 1950s, she was recruited by the CIA while on a modeling assignment overseas. What followed, she said, was a systematic program of trauma, drugging, and hypnotic conditioning that created within her an alternate personality called Arlene. This constructed identity possessed different mannerisms, a different voice, and crucially, different loyalties. Arlene existed solely to serve as a covert courier, transporting sensitive materials and messages that Candy Jones herself would never knowingly carry. The programming reportedly began with a familiar pattern. Jones was isolated, subjected to drugs she could not identify, and exposed to hypnotic induction under clinical conditions. During these sessions, her programmers emphasized that Arlene was separate, secret, and superior to the weak, ordinary Candy. They built an entire psychological architecture around this alternate self, complete with its own memories and motivations. Most disturbingly, they installed triggers, specific words or phrases that would cause Arlene to surface and Candy to recede into unconsciousness. For years, according to her account, Jones lived a double life she was not consciously aware of living. She would board flights to destinations she did not remember choosing, wake up in hotel rooms with no recollection of checking in, and find unexplained marks or injuries on her body. The lost time confused and frightened her, but the programming apparently included commands not to question these gaps too deeply, not to seek help, not to tell anyone about the strange discontinuities in her experience. The story only emerged years later when Jones married John Neville, a radio talk show host in New York City. Neville noticed his wife's strange behavioral shifts, moments when she seemed to become a different person entirely. Her voice would change. Her posture would shift. She would say things completely out of character and later deny having said them at all. Concerned, he convinced her to undergo hypnotic regression therapy with a professional hypnotherapist. What surfaced during those sessions formed the basis of a book published in 1976 titled The Control of Candy Jones. Under hypnosis, the Arlene personality emerged, speaking with different speech patterns and describing in detail the career missions she had performed. She recounted being sent to Taiwan, the Philippines, and other locations during the 1960s and early 70s, carrying documents sewn into her clothing or memorizing information to relay verbally. She described the handlers who would meet her, speak the trigger phrases, and activate her for these assignments. Most chillingly, she explained the punishment protocols built into her programming. If she resisted or tried to tell anyone about Arlene, severe pain responses would activate. Her own mind had been weaponized against itself. Skeptics questioned whether Jones's memories were genuine or perhaps false recollections created by the regression therapy itself. Hypnosis, after all, can be used not just to recover memories, but to inadvertently create them. The human mind under hypnotic suggestion is highly imaginative and eager to please the hypnotist. Was Candy Jones genuinely a victim of CIA programming? Or had she constructed an elaborate fantasy during therapy sessions, believing it to be real? No definitive proof ever emerged, no documents confirming her participation in covert programs. Yet the details she provided aligned disturbingly well with declassified MK-Ultra protocols. The technique she described matched the layering approach documented in partially released CIA files. The timeline of her supposed recruitment coincided with the height of these experimental programs. And perhaps most telling, her psychological symptoms matched those of documented trauma survivors. Dissociation, lost time, unexplained anxiety, and fragmented sense of self. Whether Candy Jones was truly programmed or suffered from other forms of trauma that manifested in these memories, her case highlights a terrible question at the heart of these experiments. Did the CIA and its contracted researchers actually succeed in creating Manchurian candidates? Or did they simply destroy vulnerable people while chasing an impossible goal? The available evidence suggests the answer more unsettling than either extreme. The programming appears to have worked partially, temporarily, and at tremendous cost. Subjects could be induced to perform actions under controlled conditions while in dissociated states. They could be made to forget what they had done through a combination of drugs, hypnosis, and suggestion. But the programming was unstable, prone to breaking down, and left psychological devastation in its wake. Every success, if they could be called that, came wrapped in failure. Subjects developed severe mental illness, lost years of their lives to confusion and dissociation, or broke free from their programming in unpredictable ways. The experiments revealed something perhaps more disturbing than proof of concept. They demonstrated that human consciousness, while not infinitely malleable, could be manipulated in profound and destructive ways. Identity could be fractured. Memory could be suppressed or falsified. Behavior could be influenced through layered trauma and chemical intervention. The techniques never produced reliable, long-term mind-controlled agents suitable for actual deployment, but they produced enough results to keep the programs running for over 2 decades, leaving an unknown number of damaged minds scattered across the country. Many subjects never knew what had been done to them. The nature of the experiments ensured that successful programming would erase itself from memory. Those who did remember, or began to remember, often found themselves dismissed as mentally ill or attention-seeking fabricators. The perfect crime, research that destroyed evidence of itself within the minds of its victims. The full scope of what was attempted and what was achieved remains hidden behind classification barriers and destroyed documents. When MK Ultra faced exposure in the mid-1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all program files. What survived came down to chance. A few boxes misfiled in the wrong warehouse, a handful of researchers who kept private notes, and the fragmented testimonies of survivors, whose memories the programmers failed to completely erase. We are left with fragments and implications, pieces of a puzzle that reveal enough to horrify, but not enough to fully comprehend. Somewhere in America, how many people still carry programming they are not aware of? How many dismissed their own lost time and personality shifts as mere quirks or mental illness, never imagining they might be scars from experiments they cannot remember consenting to? The Manchurian candidate may have remained partly fiction, but the attempt to create such a being left very real damage in very real minds. And the most unsettling question, if the technology and techniques were imperfect then, what might be possible now? Why? The corridor on the 3rd floor of the Allan Memorial Institute smelled different than the rest of the hospital. It was a peculiar combination of industrial disinfectant, stale air that had been recirculated too many times, and something else underneath it all, something organic and unsettling that clung to the back of your throat. The nurses who worked that floor in the late 1950s walked with a particular heaviness in their steps, a weight that came not from physical exhaustion, but from something far more difficult to carry. Behind the unmarked double doors, past the observation window that doctors peered through while taking notes on clipboards, lay what Cameron called his greatest achievement. He referred to it in his papers as the sleep room, though that clinical term failed to capture the horror of what actually happened in that space. The room was larger than you might expect, designed to hold multiple beds arranged in neat rows like a military barracks, or perhaps more accurately, like a morgue where the bodies had not yet stopped breathing. When you stepped inside, the first thing that struck you was the sound. It was not silence, though the patients made no noise. It was the constant whisper of tape loops playing through speakers, mounted above each bed, an endless repetition of messages that blended together into a wall of sound that was somehow both meaningless and inescapable. The tapes played the same phrases over and over, thousands of times each day. Your mother hates you. You are weak. You must become someone new. The words layered on top of each other, creating a sonic environment that felt less like treatment and more like an auditory assault on unconscious minds. The patients lay motionless in their beds, row after row of them, their bodies positioned flat on their backs with their arms at their sides. They had been there not for hours, but for days, for weeks, sometimes for months at a time. These were not people in natural sleep. They had been placed into drug-induced comas through massive doses of barbiturates and other sedatives, pushed into a state of unconsciousness so deep that their bodies barely seemed to register as living. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths. Their eyelids occasionally fluttered but never opened. Some of them had been under for so long that their muscles had begun to atrophy, their skin taking on a waxy pallor that comes from extended separation from consciousness. The smell was worse than the sound. These patients had not bathed properly in weeks. They had not used a toilet, dressed themselves, or moved under their own power. They lay in their own waste until nurses came to change them, which was never often enough given the understaffing of the ward. The human body continues its functions, even when the mind has been chemically suppressed, and the result was an odor that mixed sweat, urine, feces, and the particular scent of skin that has not seen sunlight or fresh air for an extended period. It was the smell of people rotting while still alive. Cameron called this process psychic driving, a term he invented to describe what he believed was a revolutionary new approach to treating mental illness. The theory was simple in its brutality. First, you would erase the existing personality through a combination of drug-induced coma, electroshock therapy delivered at strengths far beyond standard practice, and sensory deprivation. Once the patient had been reduced to what Cameron called a blank slate, you would rebuild them from scratch using the tape-recorded messages that played continuously during their unconscious state. You would quite literally reprogram a human being as if they were a machine that could be wiped and loaded with new software. The families of these patients had been told their loved ones were receiving cutting-edge treatment at one of the most prestigious psychiatric facilities in North America. They were informed that Dr. Cameron was a pioneer, a man whose techniques were so advanced that other institutions sent their most difficult cases to him. They signed consent forms that used vague language about sleep therapy and new psychotherapeutic approaches. They were never told that their mother, their daughter, their sister would be rendered unconscious for months at a time. They were never informed about the extent of the drugs being used or the possibility that the person they brought to the hospital might never truly come back to them. Mary Morrow arrived at the Allan Memorial Institute in 1957. She was 43 years old, a school teacher from Montreal who had been experiencing depression following the death of her father. Her family physician recommended she see Dr. Cameron, assuring her and her husband that a few weeks of treatment would help her process her grief and return to normal life. Mary checked herself involuntarily, believing she was taking a responsible step toward healing. She would spend the next 65 days unconscious in the sleep room. When Mary first entered the facility, she could walk, talk, read, write, and perform all the functions of a healthy adult. She had memories of her childhood, her wedding day, the births of her children. She knew her name, her address, her profession. She understood who she was in relation to the world around her. All of this would be systematically destroyed over the next 2 months. The process began with increasingly large doses of barbiturates administered multiple times per day. Mary was put to sleep and kept that way through continuous medication. While she was unconscious, electroshock therapy was administered at levels that would be considered torture by later standards. The shocks were delivered far more frequently and at much higher intensities than any therapeutic guideline would recommend. The goal was not to treat, but to destroy, to break down the existing neural pathways and patterns that made Mary who she was. Above her bed, the speakers played their messages on an endless loop. You are not who you think you are. Your memories are false. You must forget everything and begin again. The same words repeated thousands upon thousands of times, pouring into her unconscious mind hour after hour, day after day, week after week. In the bed next to Mary lay another woman who had been under for 88 days, the longest recorded stay in Cameron's sleep room. 2 beds over was a man on day 43. Across the aisle, a young woman on day 29. The room was filled with bodies that breathed but did not wake, people suspended in a chemical void while Cameron and his staff conducted their experiments. The nurses who worked in the sleep room learned not to think too much about what they were doing. They changed bedpans and adjusted IVs, and checked vital signs, and tried not to look too long at the faces of the people in the beds. Some of the nurses requested transfers to other wards. Others quit entirely, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with their understanding of medical care. Those who stayed developed a professional detachment that allowed them to function, a psychological partition that separated the mechanical tasks of their job from the moral implications of what those tasks supported. When Mary Morrow finally woke after 65 days, she could not remember how she had arrived at the hospital. She could not recall consenting to any treatment. She had no memory of Dr. Cameron or the procedures that had been performed on her. Large portions of her earlier life had been erased, memories of her children's early years simply gone, replaced by nothing. But the loss of memory was not the worst of it. Mary could not walk. Her muscles had deteriorated during her extended unconsciousness to the point where she could not support her own weight. She could not speak in complete sentences, her language reduced to simple words and fragments. She could not control her bladder or bowels. She could not feed herself. She could not recognize her own husband when he came to visit, staring at him with confusion and something that looked like fear. Mary Morrow, a woman who had walked into the hospital as a functioning adult with a career and a family, had been reduced to an infant state. She had to be taught again how to perform the most basic human functions. She spent months in rehabilitation learning to walk, to use a toilet, to hold a spoon. Her speech slowly returned but never fully recovered. Some of her memories came back in fragments, disconnected pieces that did not quite fit together into a coherent narrative of her life. She never taught school again. She never fully regained her independence. The woman who emerged from the sleep room bore Mary Morrow's name and face, but she was not the same person who had entered it. That person was gone, erased by chemicals and electricity and endless repetition of messages she had never chosen to hear. Mary was not unique. The sleep room processed dozens of patients through Cameron's protocols. Some emerged in better condition than others, though better was a relative term that meant they could eventually perform basic self-care rather than requiring total assistance. Others never recovered at all. They lived out the remainder of their lives in institutions, warehoused in psychiatric hospitals, because they could no longer function in the world. They had come seeking help for treatable conditions like depression or anxiety, and had been transformed into permanent patients who would never again live independently. The families who visited the sleep room often stood at the observation window, looking in at their loved ones lying motionless in the beds, and asked when they could take them home. The doctors and nurses gave vague answers about the treatment taking longer than expected, about the need for patience, about the cutting-edge nature of the work being done. They did not say that your wife, your mother, your sister might never be the person you remember. They did not warn that when she finally woke, she might not know your name or recognize your face. When patients did eventually regain consciousness, many of them experienced profound confusion and terror. They had no memory of agreeing to be unconscious for weeks or months. They had no understanding of what had been done to them while they slept. They woke into a nightmare where their bodies did not work, their memories were gone, and strange people insisted they knew them. Some patients, upon learning how long they had been unconscious, refused to believe it. Their last memory might be of a Tuesday afternoon in September, and now they were being told it was November, and nothing in between existed in their minds. Cameron documented all of this meticulously in his files. He recorded the number of days each patient spent unconscious. He noted the doses of medication and the frequency of electroshock treatments. He transcribed the messages played on the tape loops. He wrote about the results, describing memory loss and functional impairment in the detached language of scientific observation, as if these were interesting data points, rather than the destruction of human lives. In his papers and presentations, he remained convinced that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He believed that if he could just refine the technique, adjust the dosages, perfect the messages, he would unlock the secret to remaking the human mind. He viewed the damage he caused not as failure, but as the necessary cost of innovation. The patients who never recovered were, in his framework, acceptable losses in the pursuit of greater knowledge. The sleep room operated for years. The tape loops played their endless messages. The patients lay unconscious, day after day, while their lives outside the hospital continued without them. Their children had birthdays they would never remember. Holidays passed unmarked. The seasons changed from summer to fall to winter. But inside the sleep room, it was always the same artificial twilight, the same recycled air, the same whispered repetitions pouring down from the speakers. And when the patients finally woke, if they woke, they discovered that the life they remembered having, the person they remembered being, was simply gone. On January 23, 1973, a man named Richard Helms made a decision that would alter the course of investigative history. As the outgoing director of Central Intelligence, facing imminent congressional hearings and growing public scrutiny, Helms issued an order that was as simple as it was devastating. Destroy everything. Every file, every memo, every research report connected to the program, known as MK Ultra. Burn it all. And they did. Across multiple CIA facilities, personnel methodically fed documents into furnaces and shredders. Thousands upon thousands of pages detailing decades of human experimentation vanished in flames and confetti strips of paper. The systematic annihilation of evidence was so thorough, so comprehensive, that the agency believed they had successfully buried one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history. They almost succeeded. But bureaucracy, in its mundane inefficiency, sometimes becomes the accidental guardian of truth. A single cache of documents escaped destruction, not through the courage of a whistleblower or the diligence of an investigator, but through the most prosaic of human errors: misfiling. Approximately 20,000 pages had been incorrectly stored in a budget office, categorized under financial records rather than operational files. When the destruction order came through, these documents simply weren't where they were supposed to be. They survived. When these pages finally surfaced in 1977, following a Freedom of Information Act request, researchers and investigators began piecing together the fragments of what MK Ultra had actually been. What they found was horrifying enough. The experiments in Montreal under Cameron, the dosing of unwitting subjects with LSD, dye-E, the sensory deprivation chambers, the attempts to erase and rebuild human personalities. But here is what should chill you to your core. These 20,000 documents, as disturbing as they are, represent only what was misfiled. They are the accident, the exception, the tiny fraction that slipped through the cracks. Everything else is gone forever. Think about that for a moment. We know about the horrific experiments at the Allan Memorial Institute because paperwork ended up in the wrong filing cabinet. We know about certain drug trials, certain subjects, certain techniques because of a clerical error. Which means the question that haunts every researcher who has delved into this material is unavoidable. What don't we know? What was in those destroyed files? How many other facilities existed beyond Montreal? The documents that survived reference other sites, other doctors, other institutions, but often only in passing, with details that lead nowhere because the supporting documentation was incinerated. Were there other Allan Memorial Institutes scattered across the country, across the world? Were there other Cameron-like figures conducting their brutal experiments in veterans' hospitals, private clinics, prison psychiatric wings? The surviving papers hint at a network far more extensive than the public narrative admits, but the full map was fed into Helms's fires. What happened to the subjects who simply disappeared from records? In the fragments that remain, researchers have found references to patients and test subjects whose names appear once, twice, perhaps in a single memo, and then vanish completely. No follow-up report, no discharge papers, no death certificates that connect to the program. Some families spent decades searching for missing relatives, only to hit wall after wall of classified information and destroyed records. Where did these people go? What was done to them that required their complete erasure from documentation? Were there disposal protocols we will never know about? And here is perhaps the most unsettling question of all. Why do techniques eerily similar to MK Ultra methods appear in recent interrogation programs? Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, stress positions, learned helplessness, the exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. These are not new inventions. They are refinements of research that began in the 1950s. The CIA claims MK Ultra ended in 1973, the same year Helms ordered the files destroyed. Convenient timing. But the knowledge gained from those experiments, the understanding of how to break down human consciousness and rebuild it, that knowledge didn't burn. It evolved. It found new applications, new justifications, new classification. The agency has never fully disclosed the scope of MKUltra. Despite congressional investigations, despite lawsuits from victims, despite decades of FOIA requests, the official position remains one of calculated vagueness. Yes, experiments happened. Yes, some were unethical. But the full scale, the complete list of participants, the total number of victims? Still classified, still protected. The CIA has never issued a comprehensive apology. There have been acknowledgments, carefully worded statements of regret for specific incidents that became too public to deny. But a full accounting, an open admission of the scope and horror of what was done in the name of national security, that has never come. Which brings us to the most haunting possibility of all. Right now, in some classified facility whose location you will never know, whose budget is buried in appropriations under innocuous titles, whose very existence is a matter of national security, there might be someone lying in a darkened room. They might be listening to looped audio, the same phrases repeating endlessly, sinking deeper into chemically induced sleep. Their sense of self, their memories, their identity, might be slowly dissolving under protocols that bear different names now, that are justified by different threats, but that fundamentally spring from the same terrible knowledge that men like Cameron pursued. We like to believe that stories like MKUltra belong to the past, that we have evolved beyond such barbarism, that oversight and ethics committees and public awareness prevent such abuses now. But secrecy has not decreased. Black budgets have not shrunk. The conviction that some knowledge is worth any price, that some threats justify any method, that belief has not disappeared. It has simply found new classification levels. The files are destroyed. The evidence is ash. The full truth died with Richard Helms and the others who knew what was really in those documents. All we have are fragments, hints, the accidental survivors of a bureaucratic mistake. We peer through this tiny window and see horrors that destroyed lives and shattered minds. But we are looking through a keyhole at a vast warehouse, and we will never know what else was stored in that darkness. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, you have to wonder, what voices are playing just below your conscious hearing? Yeah. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all of the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.